My mom and sister ended up homeless because I finally said, enough. Growing up, it was always painfully clear who my mother's favorite was. My mom, Karen, always had a special place in her heart for my younger sister Rachel. I'm not saying this out of bitterness, though it's hard to avoid feeling a deep, lasting hurt when your mother chooses someone else over you time and time again. I remember when Rachel was born, she was a fragile little thing, underweight and sickly, which naturally sent my mom into a protective frenzy. I get it. I get why she would worry, but instead of just protecting Rachel, she began to idolize her. From that point forward, it seemed as though everything revolved around Rachel's needs, her wants, her moods. I know it might sound dramatic, but I swear it felt like I didn't even exist after Rachel came into the picture. Mom turned all her attention on her, and I became an afterthought. If Rachel needed something, it was taken care of immediately. She would ask for something, and it would just appear, no questions asked. If she wanted a toy, Mom would buy it. If she wanted to stay home from school, Mom would let her. Meanwhile, I had to work for everything I ever wanted. I remember one Christmas when I asked for a bike. I thought it would be a great gift, something I could be proud of. But no, instead, Mom gave me a pair of socks. The excuse? You're older now, you can buy your own. I couldn't help but feel the sting of that comment. That was just one example of how Mom treated Rachel like she was royalty, while I was left to fend for myself. I had to fight for my place in the family. If I needed help with schoolwork, I was on my own. If I had issues with a friend or felt overwhelmed, I wasn't allowed to show weakness. I was expected to just handle things like an adult. But Rachel? If she had a bad grade in school, Mom would swoop in and fix it. If Rachel was upset, Mom would drop everything and comfort her. If Rachel didn't feel like doing a project for school, Mom would do it for her. I watched this dynamic play out over and over, and it became increasingly clear that Rachel was the golden child, and I was the forgotten one. The emotional neglect was subtle, but it stung just as much as anything more obvious could have. Mom never showed an interest in my life, unless it somehow involved Rachel. I once had a dentist appointment when I was about 10, and Mom forgot about it. She was at a spa when I was left waiting for hours outside my school. I had no choice but to wait until a family friend noticed me and gave me a ride home. When I returned, Mom acted as if it wasn't a big deal, as if it was perfectly normal for me to fend for myself in that way. I learned to keep my disappointments to myself. The more I tried to get her attention, the more she pushed me away. My dad, Michael, may he rest in peace, was the one who truly saw me. He was the one who understood the quiet loneliness I felt. He was the one who would sneak me out for ice cream or slip me extra money when Mom wasn't looking. We had our own little world, just the two of us. But even with Dad's love and support, it didn't change the fact that I was living in the shadow of my sister's existence. Dad worked a lot, so he wasn't home as often as I wanted him to be, but when he was, he made sure I felt special. He knew I didn't get the same kind of care and attention Rachel did, and he would always make me feel valued. But when he wasn't around, it felt like I was invisible. Meanwhile, Rachel was being shielded from the realities of life. She never had to learn how to do anything for herself. Mom did everything for her, took care of her schoolwork, managed her social life, even made sure she always had someone to hang out with. She didn't have to lift a finger, and neither did she learn how to handle anything difficult on her own. It wasn't until high school that I realized just how toxic the dynamic had become. Rachel failed her classes, and instead of facing the consequences, Mom argued with the principal to change her grades. I, on the other hand, was expected to figure everything out on my own. If I struggled with a subject or didn't understand something, I had to deal with it myself. No sympathy, no help. I just had to push through. When I graduated from high school, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I got accepted to college in another city, and I left as soon as I could. It was the best decision I ever made. For the first time in my life, I was free from the constant comparisons to Rachel and the need to fight for my place. I could breathe. I could just be me. Rachel, of course, stayed behind. She never moved out until she was 26, when she got married. Even then, my mom was still all over her, calling her multiple times a day to check in, bringing her groceries, showing up uninvited to clean her house. It was beyond excessive. I, on the other hand, lived my life. I finished college, started my career, and began to build a future for myself. Throughout it all, Dad was the one who stayed in touch with me. He would call and visit when he could, but Mom sent the occasional birthday text or would comment on my Facebook posts. I wasn't bothered by it. I had come to accept that she was never going to be the kind of mother I wanted. Looking back, I now realize that my mom's obsession with Rachel was about control. She needed Rachel to need her forever. She didn't want Rachel to grow up, and she certainly didn't want Rachel to be independent. Meanwhile, I was pushed out of the nest early. I had to learn how to handle life on my own, but in the long run, that was a blessing. It made me stronger. It made me more self-sufficient. Everything changed when Dad got sick. He started coughing a lot, but at first, he just brushed it off. He wasn't one to complain, so he chalked it up to allergies or a lingering cold, but as the weeks passed, he got worse. He was tired all the time and out of breath. Still, he kept working. He kept pushing through, just as he always had. Karen, my mom, barely noticed. She was too busy with her usual routines, yoga classes, spa appointments, whatever else filled her days. I was the one who noticed. I could hear the difference in Dad's voice when we talked on the phone. I asked him if he'd seen a doctor, and he brushed it off. But I knew something was wrong. When Dad finally went to the hospital, it was serious. I dropped everything and rushed home. When I arrived, I was horrified. He looked so frail, so weak, and yet he was alone. Mom and Rachel were out getting their nails done. When they came back, Mom acted surprised to see me. She even tried to hug me, but I wasn't having it. I asked her why she wasn't with Dad, and she gave me some excuse about running errands. It was obvious they had just come from the spa, both of them looking fresh with new manicures and shopping bags in hand. The hospital admitted Dad, and I stayed by his side. Mom would drop by, but only for short visits. Rachel hardly came at all. She claimed it was too difficult to see him in that condition. It became clear that I was the only one who truly cared for Dad. I stayed up with him every night, helping him with his medication, making sure he was comfortable. I cooked his meals, helped him with his physical therapy, and kept him company so he wouldn't feel lonely. It was exhausting, but I loved him. I would do anything for him. Karen, on the other hand, barely lifted a finger. She would visit for a few minutes and then leave. She was glued to her phone, chatting with Rachel or posting on social media. I was angry, but at the same time, I felt sorry for Dad. He deserved so much more than that. Rachel, in her typical fashion, stayed in her room, avoiding the reality of what was happening. At one point, she even went on vacation while Dad was struggling. I couldn't believe it. I was the one who had to drop everything to care for him. Dad passed away a few months later, surrounded by me, the nurse, and a few friends who had come to say goodbye. Karen and Rachel weren't there. Karen had gone to a wellness retreat, and Rachel was out with friends. I called them both when it became clear that Dad didn't have much time left, but neither of them showed up. The funeral was a blur. I was heartbroken and exhausted, but I still had to deal with Karen and Rachel's nonsense. Karen spent most of the service talking to her friends about how unexpected Dad's death was, as if she hadn't been ignoring him for months. Rachel cried loudly, making a big show of her grief, but it felt so fake. Where was all the concern when Dad was alive? Where was all the love? Then came the reading of the will. It was the final betrayal. Dad had left everything to me, his house, his savings, his belongings, all of it. Karen and Rachel were furious. They fought with the lawyer, with me, with everyone in the room. How dare he leave everything to me? They couldn't believe it. They tried everything to convince me to give them a portion. Karen even said that it was only fair, that I didn't need everything. She offered me money to share the wealth, but I refused. The more they begged and pleaded, the more determined I became to stand my ground. I had put up with their selfishness for years. I had spent my life making myself smaller to accommodate their needs, and I wasn't going to let them take what was rightfully mine. The final straw came when I had to ask Rachel to leave the house that Dad had left me. She had been staying there for a few weeks, acting like it was still hers. I told her she had to go. She argued, but I was firm. I packed her things and made her leave. I knew it would be hard, but it had to be done. It was the hardest decision of my life, but it was the right one. I had spent so many years playing second fiddle to Rachel. I had been invisible to my mother, but now I was finally standing up for myself. As for Karen, I gave her one last chance to make things right. She came to me, asking for forgiveness, but forgiveness is not something you just give away. It's something that has to be earned, and my mother had never earned it. I didn't owe her anything. Rachel tried to reconcile, but I knew it was too late. Some things can't be fixed. Some wounds are too deep. So, I moved forward, carrying the weight of my past, but knowing that I had finally freed myself. I wasn't invisible anymore. I had my father's love, and I had my dignity, and that was enough.